Chapter 9, Industrial Life, Skoro Budet, it'll be here soon. As long as the bosses pretend they are paying us a decent wage, we will pretend that we are working, Soviet workers sang, 1970s. The tempo of work is different for each 10-day period of the month, said Rashid, a stocky, honey-colored factory foreman from Uzbekistan, who was explaining what work was like at the Tashkent tractor parts factory. Do you know the words spayakshka, goryakshka, and likhorotka? Literally, I knew they meant something like hibernation, hot time, and feverish frenzy, but I did not immediately associate them with his factory frenzy, so I shook my head. Rashid smiled at my innocence and rubbed a calloused hand across his cheek. Those are the nicknames we give the decades, the 10-day periods into which each month is divided, he said. The first decade is the sleeper time, the second decade is for hot work, and the third decade is like fever. He paused to let me absorb that and went on. The tempo of work also depends on payday. Normally we have 2 paydays a month, one between the 15th and 20th and the other in the first days of the next month. 2 or 3 days before payday there is a pre-holiday feeling and no one is in the mood for working. And 2 or 3 days afterward, people are practically sick from drinking, and they have to drink off their hangovers. With variations and embellishments, it was a story repeated by others, including Yosef, a tall, slender, middle-aged engineer from a big city in southern Russia, who chain smoked as he talked about the plants where he had worked. To hear his description of Soviet factories that made air conditioning and refrigeration units was to pass through a Soviet looking glass and to discover a world inside Soviet industry that seemed almost a travesty of the command economy imagined in the West to be functioning with monopolistic harmony and monolithic discipline. Storming is what Rashid and Yosef were describing. It is a practice so endemic and essential to the Soviet system that Russians have coined the fancy word shrumavoshkina to denote the entire national phenomena of crash programs and the wildly erratic work rhythm of Soviet factories, large and small, civilian and military. Storming to fulfill the monthly, quarterly, or annual plan turns every month into a sort of crazy industrial pregnancy, sluggish in gestation and frenzied at the finish. Usually, at the start of the month, an enterprise is virtually paralyzed after the storming in the final days of the preceding month. Yosef explained. By his account, the workforce was in a state of exhaustion not only because of drinking, but because so many skilled workers had been pressed into long overtime shifts during the storming campaign. A lot have to put in 2 shifts a day during storming, he said. They work all day, both Saturdays and Sundays, their normal days off. Management doesn't have the right to pay them for overtime because it has a ceiling on its payroll, and financial inspection organs check on that. Sometimes, if a worker is badly needed, he can get time and a half or double time off to compensate for his overtime, but whether or not they get time off, workers have to put in those extra days, Black Saturdays they are universally called, without extra pay, so usually there are a lot of workers off at the start of the month, and the enterprise is in a state of paralysis. Plants couldn't operate at normal capacity anyway because they do not have a lot of materials and components needed for operation. Yosef went on. In spite of the plan and seemingly definite delivery deadlines, suppliers don't fulfill the plan or meet delivery schedules, so manufacturing plants cannot work rhythmically. Normally, not enough parts and components are available until about the 10th or 12th of the month. Some items can be assembled almost completely, but they lack certain parts. A large number of items cannot be shipped out and accumulate in storerooms. They are held as late as the 20th of the month because parts aren't ready or certain components are missing. Finally comes the third decade, 20th to 30th. It's a good month if absolutely everything required is actually on hand by the 20th. When everything has finally been received, the storming of the plan can begin. Immediately, work starts in many sections simultaneously. Yosef spoke about it matter-of-factly, making clear this was a normal state of affairs for Soviet industry, not some aberration peculiar to factories where he worked or to particular seasons of the year, though December, being the end of the year, is worse than other months. In other countries, production normally goes on throughout the month, Yosef observed, but here it can only begin on the 15th or 20th when all materials have been received, so factories must fulfill about 80% of the planned quotas in the last 10 to 15 days. No one cares any longer about quality. Volume is the main thing. Some workers are sent to finish the items that were partly assembled and kept in storerooms. Some of the production is no longer finished in factory conditions, but often in the open air. Water, dirt, and dust can fall in the equipment, which of course lowers its quality and cuts down its lifespan. The whole population knows all about this because everyone works, Yosef commented. So normally, when someone buys a household appliance, he tries to buy one with a certificate saying that it was produced before the 15th of the month and not after the 15th. Soviet goods carry tags with production dates. If the item was made before the 15th, obviously it was not made in a rush, and the customer thinks maybe it will work. If it was made after the 15th, there's a good chance it will stop working pretty quickly. Other Russians with whom I talked were more flexible than Yosef, who, as a technical man, may have had higher standards than most. They reckoned it was not too great a risk to buy something made as late as the 20th, but no matter what the object, the candid advice of one middle-aged Moscow woman, echoed by others, was, don't buy if it was made after the 20th. Her husband nodded in agreement, and with a typical Russian laughter, through tears, sense of humor, launched into his favorite joke about storming. It concerned a hapless Soviet worker who died and found himself in purgatory, confronted by an official who addressed him in the stilted, condescending rhetoric of Soviet bureaucrats. According to your moral qualities, you will not be permitted to enter heaven. Your papers are not in good enough order to be accepted. You may only enter hell. My duty is to warn you that there are two sections of hell, capitalist hell and socialist hell. You have a choice. The worker inquired about the difference. In the capitalist hell, they will drive a nail into your butt every day, all month long, the official said curtly. And does the same thing go on in the socialist hell too? The socialist hell is different, comrade, the functionary advised. There, the devil gets drunk a lot, and there is a chronic shortage of nails. Well, in that case, said the newcomer, brightening, I'll take the socialist hell. All right, that is your choice, the official acknowledged, but it is my duty to warn you that all the same, they'll drive those 30 nails into your butt in the last 5 days of the month. That irreverent view of the workings of the Soviet economy has the kind of insight into Russian reality that prompted Dostoevsky to describe his native land as a sublime, universal, ordered chaos. It is a far cry, however, from the picture that Western visitors derive from officially guided tours through spruced-up Soviet industrial installations, from the image of technological prowess given by live television coverage of the Soviet Soyuz spacecraft docking with an American Apollo, or from the impression projected to the world at large by the Kremlin's perennial boasting about over-fulfilling its 5-year plans. The plan is proffered by Soviet Marxists as the key to scientific management of manpower and resources, the unerring lever for achieving maximum growth and rising productivity, the utopian device for assuring the coordinated functioning of the world's second mightiest economy. The plan comes close to being the fundamental law of the land. Fulfill the plan is one of the most incessant incantations of Soviet life. Publicly, the plan is treated with almost mystical veneration, as if endowed with some superhuman faculty for raising mortal endeavor to a higher plane, freed of human foibles. It is the 5-year plans launched in 1928 by Stalin to force the pace of industrialization that are officially credited with multiplying Soviet output 50-fold from 1913 to 73 and building the backbone of the Soviet economy. Indeed, in 6 decades, Moscow has transformed a backward economy though emerging continent into an industrialized state. It has developed the world's largest network of hydroelectric power stations, opened up the incalculable mineral riches of Siberia, produced atomic icebreakers, space platforms, and mechanized moon explorers, and surpassed America in such basic measurements of industrial muscle as output of steel, cement, and oil. But the plan, as some internal critics have noted in their Aesop-ian language, has hardly assured the clockwork functioning of the economy. Along with dramatic growth, it has spawned rigidity, waste, and lopsided development. In ways, the Soviet system has seemed less a planned economy than a system for concentrating on principal targets, so that the Kremlin could set priorities and mobilize mass effort behind them. Like most other Westerners, I had been unaware, for example, that the Soviet leadership had been so successful in putting its population to work that in 1970 the Soviet workforce numbered 122 million compared to only 85 million in America, including the unemployed. Through the mechanism of the plan, Soviet leaders have made enormous investments in heavy industry, military production, and science, and especially during the sharp growth of the Stalin era, financed this mainly by exacting heavy sacrifices from Soviet consumers. As one Western expert commented, Stalin bequeathed to his heirs both a great industrial power and an inefficient economy. His enshrinement of the centralized plan was probably more suited to the rapid muscular buildup of the economy than to the present period, when the Soviet economy faces more sophisticated problems of modernization. Soviet growth rates have slowed in the 70s, though Western specialists still reckon that on the average the Soviet economy was growing twice as fast as the American economy from 1968 to 74. With economic controls and centralized pricing, Russians have cushioned themselves from the gyrations of boom and bust and double-digit inflation that have rocked Western economies, largely unperturbed by serious debates about environment or the wisdom of maximum economic growth that now perplex Western leaders. Soviet officials, from Brezhnev to the lowest village party secretary, rattle off production statistics and plan quotas with a kind of undiminished 19th century infatuation with the sheer magic of output enthusiastically expressed by Marx. They point with pride to massive industrial conglomerates made possible, they feel, only by the plan's awesome ability to focus vast resources on projects of top national priority. The Kama River truck plant is the Soviet crash project, par excellence the showpiece of the 1971 through 75 five-year plan. I've seen other Soviet installations like Bratsk High Dam that rival Western facilities for modern technology. I've met Western businessmen who waxed eloquent about electronics plants at Riga and Leningrad, or encountered American aircraft specialists raving about what Soviet engineers were doing with modern metals like titanium at the Voronezh aircraft plant, which makes the Tu-144 supersonic transport, but none of these matches the Kama River truck plant as an archetype of the gigantomania of Soviet planners, as a symbol of the Soviet faith that bigger means better, and the Soviet determination to have the biggest at any cost. Kama is the kind of massive crash project that appeals to Russians. It embodies industrial might created from a vacuum and materialized in a furious 5-year flurry of storming. It emanates brute strength. In 1971, Soviet construction brigades started from scratch to build the world's largest truck plant in the open, rolling, windswept plains about 600 miles east of Moscow. By the time I got there in '73, what had been empty rye fields near a sleepy rural community of weather-beaten peasant cabins had been transformed into a throbbing, rapid-growing city of 90,000. High-rise apartments for construction workers stood wall-to-wall across the horizon, close to $700 million worth of the most modern industrial machinery from the United States, West Germany, Japan, France, and elsewhere was on order, and construction crews were being exhorted to enclose the frames of factory buildings before winter so that equipment could be installed. For hours, our group of correspondents were driven by bus, slithering through ankle-deep mud in July, past mile upon mile of pipelines-covered conveyor belts, giant factory skeletons. The sheer magnitude of the project was staggering. Soviet engineers informed us that Kama was not just one factory but 6, all huge: a foundry, a forging plant, a body plant, an engine plant, an instrument and repair plant, and an assembly plant, to be linked by 175 miles of computer-run conveyor belts and assembly lines. The production complex, costing in the billions, occupies 23 square miles, an area larger than the entire island of Manhattan. At full capacity, Kama is slated to produce 150,000 heavy-duty trucks and 250,000 diesel engines a year, dwarfing anything in Detroit or the German Ruhr. As the premier project of the National 5-Year Plan, Kama has enjoyed vast advantages over run-of-the-mill Soviet industries, yet for all its exalted priority, it has been plagued by chronic problems that bedevil the Soviet economy in spite of planning. In 1969, the cost of Kama and its satellite city was reckoned at about $2.2 billion. By 1975, the figure had ballooned to $5 billion, a sign not only of higher prices for Western machinery, but industrial inflation at home as well. For all the planned deadlines and Kremlin attention, the construction schedule had slipped badly. When I was at Kama, huge banners urged, "Let's give the motherland the first Kama truck in '74, yet by fall '75 it had yet to appear. In any case, I found it hard to understand why the rush, except as a way of whipping up national fervor and projecting Soviet prestige. The explanation of Soviet planners was that trucks were needed to break the national transportation bottleneck, but the Soviet highway network, let alone the auto service network, is hardly in shape to handle an enormous new fleet of heavy trucks. It is only about one-fourth as large as the American highway system, and 60% of it is dirt or gravel roads, impassable to heavy trucks. Moreover, I couldn't help wondering whether there were enough Soviet customers ready to put the trucks to efficient use. For one of the most baffling aspects of traffic around Moscow was the hordes of trucks barging through traffic, belching black fumes but empty. Russians and foreigners alike used to chuckle at all the empty trucks. This numbing waste of truck capacity made the ambitious production targets for Kama reminiscent of the breakneck race to put Bratsk High Dam in operation by '61, even though the Bratsk aluminum plant, its main customer, was not completed for another decade. Bratsk was a planning goof that even some Soviet economists had criticized. Nonetheless, at Kama, planned targets had an iron logic of their own. Despite delays, Russians claimed, and Western industrialists conceded, that they were building this vast facility more rapidly than would be done elsewhere. Yet the enormous haste imposed by arbitrary planned deadlines made waste. Theoretically, to save time, the Russians plunged headlong into constructing factory buildings before technical plans had been drafted, before Soviet foreign trade firms had contracted for the equipment to be installed in the plants, or before designs for trucks had been produced. One result was that some buildings later had to be altered to accommodate the equipment, and some expensive Western machinery waiting to be installed was stuck in makeshift warehouses or left outside to rust. In '73, the Soviet bosses at Kama complained to American newsmen that Swindle Dressler, the American firm hired to design the metal foundry, was falling behind schedule and upsetting the whole timetable. Months later, I was privately told by Swindle Dressler executives that the holdup was because Soviet engineers, born and bred in a system of secrecy, would not give Americans the specifications for Soviet equipment to which American machinery was to be connected. Without specifications, it was impossible to draft engineering designs. Another obstacle, they said, was the terrible delay caused by protracted Soviet dickering over prices with Western equipment suppliers. Technical plans had to wait until Soviet buyers made up their minds. Even where work went swiftly, the Soviets paid a price in quality. Engineers like Viktor Perstov, the red-faced veteran construction boss at Kama, were fond of bragging that Soviet construction brigades could throw up a 14-story apartment building, 300 units, in a month. From a distance, the apartments looked good enough, but up close they were falling apart soon after occupancy, victims of the instant aging that afflicts almost all Soviet construction. Floors were uneven, windows and walls cracked, kitchen and bathroom plumbing fixtures were crude and badly joined. Generally, the workmanship was shoddy, as it is almost everywhere. When an American correspondent asked a Russian why it was all so poorly done, the Russian shrugged. It belongs to no one, so no one cares about it. In short, the mechanistic Soviet economic plan seems to cut against the grain of Russian nature. In a world at large, Russians have a reputation for discipline because of their seemingly docile obedience. To authority, but this is a discipline imposed from outside. Left to their own devices, Russians are generally an easygoing disorderly, pleasantly disorganized, and not very efficient people. Significantly, the Russian language had no word for efficiency and had to borrow one from English. The typical Soviet office, often unseen by foreign visitors, is a super-crowded, disorderly muddle with a little propaganda corner and not enough desks to go around for everyone. I was told by Moscow friends. Factories through which I was taken were usually neat, though I was struck by the terrible din of machinery and by how few industrial safety signs there were, but Soviet friends insisted these were pokazuka factories spruced up for show, and that the run-of-the-mill Soviet factory was a bordello, as more than one put it. Moreover, the foreigner can tour plenty of installations and stare at machinery without learning about storming, or understanding that the Russian sense of time is at once enchantingly and frustratingly loose or non-existent. It bears little relation to time in a commercial society. Most tourists learn to their consternation that just ordering dinner in a restaurant can require an hour or more. A 1-hour press conference begins nearly an hour late and runs for 2 more. A short answer can take 45 minutes. A 10-minute drop in with friends invariably stretches to 3 or 4 hours. Staying late until 2 or 3 a.m. is one of the more attractive Russian vices. A week's job takes 3 weeks. Elevators break down and stay out of order for a fortnight or more. Other repair work consumes unpredictable gobs of time. Construction timetables nationwide run for years behind. Russians are genuinely put off by impatience of Westerners, especially Americans, who go up the wall with frustration at the dawdling uncertainties of Russian life. The innocent Western visitor, assuming that the Soviet Union is an advanced society, is often bruised when he first bumps against the essentially underdeveloped tempo of most Soviet commerce. It takes a while to learn that Skoro, Budet, literally, it'll be here soon, is really manana stretched to eternity, for procrastination is built into the Russian temperament. Perhaps that's the main reason for constant propaganda hounding Russians to finish the plan on time. Although Russians are capable of great exertion if pressed to produce, sustained hard work is not a national characteristic. They do not have the work ethic of Americans, Germans, or Japanese. Americans work hard, put in long hours, get ahead, and also get ulcers, was the comment of a Soviet editor, who admitted that he rarely strained on his job. Russians don't work very hard or try very hard, and we live more relaxed lives. A school teacher told Anne that she considered her job the best part of her life because no one pushes me there. Martens, an Armenian-American communist who voluntarily returned from New York to try living in the Soviet Union, told me he was astonished at the Soviet image of Americans. They think everyone in America is rich, he gasped. They don't realize how hard people have to work in America. A movie script writer suggested that one reason many Russians don't work harder is that generally it doesn't pay enough. If one doctor in a polyclinic gets a reputation for good, conscientious work, she winds up with extra patients and a lot of overtime work, but she cannot be paid for overtime, the writer said, whereas those who get ahead are usually doctors who speak up in a party meetings and curry favor with party officials. Another reason Russian friends reminded me is that the Soviet Union is still not as money-oriented as Western societies. Money alone is not enough. You have to have something to spend it on, remarked a young scientist. Connections matter more than money. With connections, you can find the deficit goods and spend the money. Without them, it's not worth the effort. Playing hooky from work is a national pastime, so common that Arkady Rakin, the comedian, has gotten censors to approve several skits on that theme. In one, he plays an engineer who lolls all day on a bed the size of a putting green and rationalizes skipping work by recalling how little he does on the job. "I'm doing them a favor by staying away," he quips, and another three men sneak out during working hours to the barber shop, but get lousy service because the barbers themselves are trying to sneak away. One barber wants to buy oranges, another to get some gadget repaired, and the third to visit the dentist. The barbers return defeated, only to discover that the grocer, repairman, and dentist are the three customers sitting in their chairs. "That's just what happens," a Russian confessed to me during intermission. "My wife goes out shopping during working hours. It's the only way because after work the crowds in the stores and the lines are simply terrible. Everybody does it." A linguist told me her friends would duck out of work just to pay social calls or see a movie. If part-time hooky is a pervasive problem among white-collar workers, full-scale absenteeism among blue-collar workers reaches such disaster proportions, especially around paydays, that the Kremlin leadership and Soviet press periodically inveigh against slackers and bad labor discipline. The Moscow manager for a Western airline told me his Soviet ground crews were so unreliable that his Western technical chief had to check personally that fuel was available, ground service ready, and de-icing and other equipment prepared for the incoming flights. On the days that their planes came in, the technical chief would pick up his Soviet mechanics and workmen at home to ensure they would be on the job. Soviet managers have a great deal of trouble disciplining factory workers, not only because it is almost impossible to fire them, but also because labor is generally short and a disgruntled worker knows he can quit and find another job easily. Theoretically, Soviet Marxism holds that workers are not alienated under socialism because they enjoy the full fruits of their labor, and Soviet propagandists seek to maintain the fiction, but occasional sociological studies and press items revealing that 2.8 million workers changed jobs in the Russian Republic alone in '73 undercut that contention. Poor working conditions and lack of side benefits, such as housing rather than pay, are cited by workers as reasons for dissatisfaction. From a few limited contacts with blue-collar workers, I gathered that there are more labor management frictions over pay and work norms than I had imagined. One man, who later became an engineer, said that when he was 17, being taught by an older worker how to operate a lathe, he had asked whether it could not be operated faster. "Yes, but shut up," the older man said. "Next month they are revisiting the norms, so we slowed it down on purpose." Soviet industry is run on the old 19th century company town basis and Soviet unions, as company unions are more interested in doling out vacation passes and welfare benefits or helping to keep workers in line than in battling with management over bread and butter issues. In fact, very few cases of group job actions in Soviet industry ever come to light. The press suppresses that news, and if word reaches Westerners, it is often months or years later. Nonetheless, through Moscow friends, I met several factory workers who told me that slow-down protests occasionally do take place on assembly lines. Yuri, a burly young metal worker, mentioned 2 instances in his metal pouring plant near Moscow, but did not want to discuss them for fear the news might be traced back to him. He did, however, describe to me how 3 brigades in a neighboring textile plant had shut down their assembly lines for several hours to protest introduction of automatic knitting machines with higher work norms resulting in lower pay. The technique of Soviet management in such cases, Yuri said, was artificially to select one brigade as perodoviki, model workers, and to grant them large pay bonuses and other privileges based on phony output figures on the new machinery. Their results then became the pretext for raising norms of the 3 other brigades. The ordinary brigades found out they were being finangled, hence the protest. Although the shutdown lasted only 3 hours, it was serious enough for the plant's security section to investigate, Yuri said, because it involved 3 different lines. If it had been just 2, they figure that it's nothing unusual because 2 brigades could get into an argument, he explained, but 3 lines is an emergency. It means someone organized it. That's very serious. I don't know what happened to the organizers, but I heard that the bosses had to back down and lower the norms. In an effort to increase output, the Communist Party resorts to various moral inducements, from special awards to model workers to socialist competition between work brigades or factories to the perennial technique of socialist obligations. Before every great holiday, work collectives across the country take upon themselves obligations to exceed their work norms. They solemnly pledge to implement party decisions to increase their ideological level and to raise their output. Steel mills promise to roll out 110% of their quota of steel. Candy factories vow to produce a year's output of sweets in just 11 months, and libraries take an oath to ensure that an unprecedented number of books by or about Lenin will be read in the next 3 months. Another favorite gimmick of Soviet propagandists is the Vestrechny plan, literally the counter plan, or the plan the workers themselves put forward to meet, match, and exceed the official plan fixed for them. Theoretically, it is spontaneously offered, but the entire ritual is widely viewed as such cynical humbug that factory workers have contrived their own raunchy put-down of the Vestrechny plan. According to this joke, a factory worker arrives home late one evening, and to protect himself from his wife's scolding, he explains that he was delayed by a long factory meeting on the Vestrechny plan. "What is this Vestrechny plan?" asked his skeptical spouse. "Well," he says, "it's as if I proposed that we screw twice tonight, and you come back and propose we screw 3 times when we both of us know damned well we couldn't do it more than once." The 2 young Russians who told me this joke as we walked along a Moscow boulevard broke into loud guffaws and were disappointed that I was not similarly moved by their earthy humor. "At least you get the idea about the Vestrechny plan?" one asked. I nodded. Despite the party's attachment to such gimmickry, industrial managers seem to rely on more pay as the best incentive. High-priority projects, especially those in hardship conditions, such as the Siberian oil fields or gold mines, often pay triple or quadruple the average Soviet blue-collar wage of 187 monthly. The Soviet economy is laced with a bewildering maze of bonuses and premiums for fulfilling plan quotas, but workmen like Yuri said the basic premiums are quickly taken for granted as a fixed part of workers' pay and thus lose leverage. Yuri's picture of political and social attitudes among his fellow workers corresponded surprisingly to American blue-collar ethnic conservatives attracted by Alabama's Governor George Wallace. On the job, he said, they have a certain camaraderie. The men cover for each other within the work brigade, if one is sick or has a big event like a wedding or birthday to celebrate, but they dislike habitual drunkards. And model workers, drunkards because they impose extra burdens on others, and model workers, Yuri said, because they are usually picked by the party for political reasons or by management to raise the norms. Class feelings are strong, like the Wallace constituency with its sniping at pointy heads and intellectuals. Soviet laborers, according to Yuri, talk contemptuously of intellectuals as nakolobniki, parasites living off the bread of others. He quoted a worker's proverb deriding the intelligentsia: "A fish begins rotting from the head." The workers were loyal to the Soviet system and the party, Yuri affirmed, but they bore no love for the big factory bosses, riding around in chauffeured black Volga sedans. If there were ever a second revolution, it would be first against the bosses in the black Volgas, he said, but he hastened to add, of course there won't be any second revolution. President Nikolai Pogorny once grandly called the Soviet factory director a plenipotentiary representative of the Socialist State and Communist Party, and a Soviet woman whom I met said her husband, who had run a 12,000-man factory in central Russia, was like a prince within his domain. Although nominally his salary was 450 rubles a month, he actually earned twice that much through a series of regular bonuses. Moreover, he could command free services from the factory and receive special monthly food cartons, free from elite stores in Moscow. His family was assigned choice, cheap, comfortable housing, and they could buy meat, eggs, and produce from neighboring state farms for a song. They vacationed for practically nothing at Council of Ministers guest houses and enjoyed such other privileges as a direct telephone line to the Kremlin. All the people in the village would say, when I would go by, "There goes the wife of the big boss," and they would hypocritically be nice to me, flatter me, and so on, she said. Compared to others, her family lived like nobility. Nonetheless, this woman regarded her husband's job as a nightmare and steered her sons away from such career ambitions. As she told it, July was the hottest month because her husband spent all his time beating down the plan, wrangling with his ministry to lower targets for his plant in the coming year. It was vital, she explained, for the factory director not to disclose his plant's real capacity and never to exceed his current planned targets by more than 1 or 2%, because otherwise his quotas would be raised too steeply next year. One constant worry was that the chief engineer, traditionally regarded in Soviet factories as the ministry's man, appointed by higher-ups independently of the director, might undercut him. Like other factory directors, she said her husband always kept plenty of extra workmen on his payroll so that he had enough hands to successfully storm the plan. Then, too, he could loan workers to other factories in return for equipment or favors that he wanted because, as she put it, there isn't a single successful factory director who operates by the book. You can't do it. Nor was the plan his one only big worry. He had to keep on the good side of the local party bigwigs, and that meant supplying them with workers for the harvest, for road construction and other pet projects. Never mind how padded payrolls undermined efficiency. A factory director knew, she said, that if he got into trouble, it was more likely to be because he failed to keep the party hierarchy happy than because his efficiency was slipping. Ultimately, she disclosed it was politics, not economics, that cost her husband his job in the early 70s. The most constant headache, as she saw it, was the unending struggle with supplies. Thefts were a serious nuisance. Whole rail carloads of raw materials or parts would disappear or simply never show up. But more often it was simply the delays. At home the phone would ring all night, she said. people telling my husband, the metal hasn't come yet from Siberia, or the parts aren't here from Odessa, all the time. Sometimes, for a factory director, it's helpful when raw material is late in delivery because he can use that as an alibi for getting his plan lowered. But not all raw materials are top priority and can be used as an alibi. Those which are lower priority he must beat out of the system himself. That aspect of her story was corroborated by a Soviet journalist who landed by chance in the Leningrad factory director's office when one of his shop superintendents informed him the factory was out of metallic lacquer and would have to shut down temporarily. The director got on the phone and called the party committee of the province, the industrial department. The journalist told me. Why them? Because toward the end of the month, a general redistribution of shortage materials takes place. There is a hierarchy of enterprises. Is in the first rank military factories, in the second heavy industry, and in the third rank light consumer industry. All the reserve materials that have been accumulated by light industry are withdrawn, confiscated for the sake of heavy industry. The director called them to take the metallic lacquer from some light industry factory, but he was too late. They told him, "It's not possible to do anything for you. Someone else has already stolen it." That's exactly what they said, stolen. You've got to steal some lacquer for our factory, or we won't fulfill the plan, the director told them. And they said, we would have stolen something for you with pleasure, but a more important factory has already had time to steal it. You were late. You should have called us 2 days ago. According to my journalist friend, the factory director was in such a jam he called the party boss for the province, hoping that through personal influence he could obtain lacquer from a party boss in a neighboring province. The party bosses have permanent connections with each other, the journalist said. Today, one helps the other. Tomorrow, it is the other way around. His party boss agreed to get the material, but only the day after tomorrow. That meant today and tomorrow the workers would have nothing to do, and still there would be hardly time enough to fulfill the monthly plan. So the director decided to let the workers have a day off, but make them work a Black Saturday. The chronic shortages of supplies, which the plan does not take into account, force industrial managers to cut corners and adopt shady practices that, technically speaking, the system frowns on but simply has to tolerate. As Vestia, the government newspaper, once held up a factory director as a bad example for hoarding huge stocks of metal to cushion himself against shortages, but he had a ready reply. You know the saying, if you want a 2-hump camel, you must order a 3-hump camel. The system will shave off the extra hump. Theoretically, companies can sue each other for late delivery of supplies, but it is such a cumbersome procedure and yields such unsatisfactory results that most factories use tolkachi, or pushers, legendary semi-illegal Soviet middlemen, to bludgeon or bribe their suppliers into sending materials on time, or to finagle complicated swaps with other plants outside the plan. The fundamental problem is that since everybody's output is someone else's input, shortages at one stage of production have a domino effect. Caught in a squeeze, many factories simply shortchange customers by cutting down ingredients to stretch out their supplies. A canning engineer admitted to a Soviet friend of mine that such a hanky-panky was standard practice in his industry. If we add less sugar to jam, then the jam needs or disregard quality standards for the fruit. We can produce more canned goods and meet the plan, he said. This had once caused him embarrassment during an international canning conference. We were tasting Bulgarian canned goods, and we were almost thrilled with the high quality and good taste, he recalled. We asked the representative of the Bulgarian firm how they managed such high quality. He looked at us in surprise. Why, we always follow your Soviet recipes and technology without change. His reply put us in an awkward position because we could never afford to follow our own recipes. Sometimes the deception practiced is more blatant. A poultry breeder from Central Asia explained that his state farm, one of the nation's largest, regularly fudged its figures to show it had met the plan. The daily target was 100,000 eggs, he said, and the farm consistently ran about 30,000 short. The breeder said he would report the accurate daily total to the director, who gave a false report to regional superiors. The director reported that the day's plan had been fulfilled, the breeder said, and the next morning he would order me to write off 30,000 to 40,000 eggs as if they had been broken and fed to the chickens, even though those eggs never existed. Similarly, he said, feed shipments would regularly arrive at the farm with 1.5 to 2 tons out of 30 tons missing, indicating that someone else was meeting his plan by short waiting. It is a tale told in one form or another by people from all walks of Soviet life. Cooking the books, or double counting, occasionally exposed in the official press, are so widely practiced that many Soviets simply disbelieve official claims about plan fulfillment. Not many months after my arrival in Moscow, a chemical engineer told me that the central government made innumerable adjustments, lowering various planned targets during the year, so that technically speaking at year's end the overall plan was fulfilled. Public confirmation came later during a purge in Soviet Georgia, where the plan had regularly been reported as fulfilled. The new party boss made a series of speeches chastising Georgian industry and agriculture for poor performance and revealing how disastrously, in fact, the Georgian economy had fallen short of official targets. Something similar happened later in Armenia. By the time I had left Moscow, I had no reason to doubt that the jimming the plan went on everywhere. Indeed, one distant economist, writing under a pseudonym and buried somewhere in the state administration, circulated an underground document showing how in category after category the economy had fallen short of the 66 through 70 five-year plan targets, even though overall growth of national income had met planned objectives. Hidden inflation covered up most of the shortfall. Month in and month out, the pressure of the plan had undoubtedly forced Russian workers to disgorge a greater volume of output than would have emerged without planned deadlines. But the plan mentality has also spawned a chaos all its own, because the plan, and ultimately that means the Kremlin leadership operating through Gosplan, the state planning agency, has demanded more than can be reasonably delivered by an economy of chronic shortages. The plan has engendered storming, feather bedding in factory workforces, the end-of-the-month hassle over raw materials, the short-changing phony figures, and systematic deception at all levels. Sometimes it is self-defeating in ironic little ways. A scientist related to me how his institute, shocked to discover near the end of one year that it had not exhausted its fund allotment for new equipment, quickly bought an expensive, very fancy but totally unnecessary piece of gadgetry rather than risk having next year's allocations cut back because this year's were not used up. At a more humble level, a schoolteacher confessed her panic when she had found 800 unspent rubles in a school fund. I went out and bought 800 rubles worth of cactus plants for the school, she said. As an American military attaché in Moscow irreverently compared the Soviet economic system to the U.S. Army. It's a bureaucracy, he said, where the rules are, don't buck the system, don't make any waves, don't go looking for extra work. Don't push for reforms because that means changing the way of doing things. Just cover your ass. Nowhere, it seems, is the cover your ass philosophy more assiduously applied than in the construction industry, where projects are solemnly proclaimed complete for the sake of holding a ceremonial opening on schedule even though projects are not ready for operation. The classic case was reported by my colleague, Ted Shadbad, who found an article in Trud, the trade union newspaper, on June 14, 1973, admitting that an elaborate ceremony marking the startup of a new Siberian power generator at Nazarevo in December of '68 had been phony, and that nearly 5 years later the generator was still not in operation. At the time of the supposed commissioning, the Soviet press carried inflated front-page articles hailing the startup at Nazarevo as the beginning of a technological revolution, but Trud disclosed that actually the 500,000 kilowatt steam turbine generator had burned out on the factory floor during testing and was not even at the power plant for commissioning, contrary to earlier Soviet press accounts reporting on how new power from Nazarevo surged into the Siberian power grid. Trud admitted that the needles of the instruments indicating power output did not move. There was no current, and how could there be any sense? The manufacturer had not even supplied the generator. The inauguration ceremony, together with band music and speech-making, was therefore purely symbolic. For the controlled Soviet press and the hypersensitive Soviet leadership, such an open admission is unprecedented, but Soviet friends told me that the Nazarevo incident was far from unique. Avgust, a balding Jewish construction engineer from Latvia, with an impish smile, spent an hour or two one afternoon rattling off construction cover-ups from his own experience. Once he said, not until the banquet celebrating commissioning of a factory was it discovered that the interior piping had not been hooked up with the outside sewer lines. We knew it would take a lot of time and effort to fix this, Avgust said, but the act of commissioning had already been signed, and nobody wanted to take responsibility for so shameful a mistake. So it was agreed that the building would officially be considered complete and, in effect, ready to operate, but the plumbing disaster would be listed in the small print among certain imperfections. On another occasion, he said, an iron rolling mill was all complete except for delivery of some key machinery. His construction organization was eager to write off the factory as finished in order to qualify for its end-of-the-project bonuses. The client enterprise finally agreed to accept the factory as in a state of starting operations for adjustment. That suited both sides, Avgust said, because in that condition the factory had no planned targets but received state funds to test and adjust its machinery. It went on that way for 2 years before the machinery came, Avgust said. More typical, according to Avgust, was the situation at a textile plant. Because the machinery was not delivered until the last minute, construction crews left 20 by 20 foot holes in the outer factory walls for inserting it. Literally on the eve of commissioning, Avgust said the last equipment arrived, was put in place, and construction crews quickly closed up the holes. We put in bricks, plaster, and painted all at once, he said. Each of these operations takes time and requires waiting before the next. Bricklaying requires time for shrinkage. Plaster should dry before painting, and so on, but we had no time for waiting and did everything contrary to the rules. While bricklayers were doing the brickwork, plasters started plastering from the bottom up, and painters started painting the wet walls. Everyone knew that within 2 or 3 months, paint would peel, plaster would flake off, and brickwork would crack, but it didn't matter. Our only worry was to finish on time. When I heard that, my thoughts flashed back to the shoddy construction in the apartments at the Kama River truck plant, and in so many other buildings I had seen in city after city. The sad letter to the editors in Soviet newspapers from new apartment dwellers were ample testimony that this is a standard technique used by construction organizations bent on claiming completion of so many square meters of floor space by the deadline in order to qualify for plan fulfilling bonuses. Government officials knowingly connive with them out of eagerness to proclaim how many new apartments they were providing. In its oafish way, the Soviet economy muddles through in spite of such chicanery. As the Kama River truck plant project suggests, Soviet planners count on industrial brawn to compensate for lack of finesse. The real drag on the Soviet economy, and one that has worried the Brezhnev-Koshkin leadership, even though it does not show up in statistics on economic growth or plan fulfillment, is the inability of Soviet socialism to generate enough good modern technology and to convert it into production fast enough. Over the decades, Moscow may have produced impressive growth rates, though the pace is now slowing, but the dynamism of innovation has been missing. The planned Soviet economy lacks the driving forces of competition that stimulates technological development in the West, and communist planners and theorists have yet to devise an adequate substitute. Practically the entire system, top to bottom, resists new inventions, new products, new ideas. Deterrents are woven into the very fabric of the Soviet economy. Generally, innovations seem to emanate from decrees issued on high with little input from ultimate consumers. They are developed in huge research institutes which operate independently from industrial enterprises and which take more pride in having some special, one-of-a-kind, hand-tooled sample gadget for show, pokazuka, in a Soviet industrial exhibit than in getting it into production. Even pushed by some agency, a new proposal must thread its way through a labyrinthine process of approvals from central bureaucracy immobilized by a maze of technical regulations. One Soviet executive was quoted in the press as complaining that in order to produce a simple aluminum cup, he needed consent from 18 organizations, not only in Moscow but in other cities. Vladimir Dudinsev's famous novel, Not by Bread Alone, was the tale of an inventor's unbelievable struggle against the bureaucracy to see his breakthrough metallurgical invention accepted. The newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda has run periodic articles exposing active suppression by the bureaucracy of new ideas, from efficient shoemaking machinery to new orthopedic treatments. The very institutes assigned to develop new techniques, it reported, often take the lead in squelching ideas from outsiders. In October of '72, Pravda recounted the ordeal of a factory in Omsk, which had done market research and come up with a proposal for making clothes. Trees, Soviet apartments, have no closets, and most people dislike naked hooks on the wall. It had to ask Moscow for a high-level decision on the price. No word for 3 months. Then came a request from the All-Union Institute of Furniture Design and Technology asking for an entirely new application in triplicate, with pictures, more waiting. The factory sent an executive to Moscow and discovered its file had been lost. When Pravda printed its story, the factory had been waiting for 10 months and faced a damage claim filed by a trade organization that had ordered 2,000 clothes trees and was tired of waiting for them. Still no answer. The canning engineer, who had been embarrassed by the good Bulgarian jam, related a case of stupefying resistance to change. Normally, his cannery in Mordovia pickled green tomatoes, but when some shipments delayed in transit began arriving with ripened red tomatoes, he quickly adapted and began pickling red tomatoes. They weren't standard, but they were really good, and they saved the state thousands of rubles, he said. But I was not rewarded and praised for it. Just the opposite. A special commission arrived to inspect my work. They didn't want to believe that I had intended to save those red tomatoes for the state and not for myself. They suspected me of stealing, and although they had no evidence against me, this incident caused me endless troubles. There was a chain of party meetings, and I was almost expelled from the party. Just in time, I remembered an old wartime instruction about using all kinds of raw materials, whether standard or not, and it saved me. Russians tell innumerable stories of such inbred bureaucratic nitpicking opposition to innovation in their society. This occurs in other societies as well. But what was particularly Russian about this, the canning engineer's experience, was the deep suspicion, the overreaction, and the narrow escape from drastic retribution over something so trivial. Quite properly, Western economies, especially the United States, are characterized by critics for squandering natural resources, energy, the environment, and being prodigiously wasteful of things like cars, appliances, and gadgetry produced with built-in obsolescence. But in the West is far less wasteful of people and ideas than Soviet society, which stifles not only dissenters, but able engineers, researchers, and people with an urge to improve their system, whose ideas are regularly aborted or stillborn because the system so sternly resists originality. The structure run from the top down is essentially to blame, but not all bottlenecks are in the central bureaucracy. Brezhnev once supposedly remarked that Soviet factory managers avoid innovations, the way the devil shies away from incense. He did not add that inflexible plan requirements are the main reason for this attitude, but an experienced Soviet newsman laid it out for me this way. In a planned economy, a man with a new and more efficient machine is dangerous to everyone. I'll tell you why. The plan demands 100% production 12 months a year, 24, maybe 30 days a month. Everything is all calculated out. Productivity of machines in the factory, size of the workforce, amount of steel, and other materials needed. Planners know just about what can be produced. If you introduce new machinery, you have to shut down the plant or part of it. That means that the plan will not be fulfilled. That is bad for the factory director and the workers. They will not get the bonuses that sometimes comprise 20 to 30% of their pay. It is bad, too, for the ministry in charge of the factory, because it will not fulfill its plan. And if you stop the plant, to install new machinery, and that takes several months, you have to stop delivery of steel and other output from that plant, which goes to other plants, and they will have trouble fulfilling their plans. That is the problem with the planned economy. The plan is a brake on its own growth, on improving the efficiency of the economy. During my years in Moscow, the Soviet leadership was obviously concerned about this. One indication was the decision to make labor productivity, the Soviet code word for efficiency, a principal indicator for successful plan fulfillment. Yet despite constant reports of success, the efficiency gap between East and West did not noticeably narrow. The Soviet economy may rank second to the American in terms of total output, but even by Soviet statistics, its output per capita in '73 ranked 15th, and by American calculations, it ranked 25th, behind the United States, Canada, West Germany, France, Britain, all of Northern and Central Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, several oil-producing Arab states, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia. What I noticed traveling through Russia that factories, stores, farms, restaurants, or barber shops always seem to have an inordinate number of spare people on the job is borne out by statistics. The 1973 Soviet Economic Yearbook rated Soviet industry as just about half as efficient as American construction industry, about two-thirds as efficient, and agricultural about one-fourth. Occasional articles by some efficiency-minded Soviet economists have pointed out that when Russia has bought plants from the West, it has sometimes employed up to 8 times as many laborers, neutralizing the efficiency of Western technology. All of this seems hard to square with Soviet cosmonauts in orbit with Americans, or with dire warnings from generals and admirals of the West threatened by new generations of multi-headed Soviet missiles or nuclear submarines. How can the Soviets look so good if reality is so bad? The answer to this paradox is twofold. One element of the answer lies in the Russian psyche, the Soviet obsession with overcoming historic Russian backwardness in relation to the West. This is not just a matter of power, but of national self-respect. Like the czars before them, Soviet leaders are driven by a burning sense of inferiority and a determination to overcome Russia's historic backwardness. No less a figure than Stalin gave voice to this compulsion in 1934 when he declared, "To slacken the tempo would mean falling behind, and those who fall behind get beaten. But we do not want to be beaten. No, we refuse to be beaten." One feature of the history of old Russia was the continual beatings she suffered because of her backwardness. She was beaten by the Mongol Khans. She was beaten by the Turkish Beys. She was beaten by the Swedish feudal lords. She was beaten by the Polish and Lithuanian gentry. She was beaten by the British and French capitalists. She was beaten by the Japanese barons. All beat her because of her backwardness, military backwardness, cultural backwardness, political backwardness, industrial backwardness, agricultural backwardness. They beat her because to do so was profitable and could be done with impunity. It is almost impossible to exaggerate the importance of this gnawing inferiority complex as a clue to Soviet motivation in relations with the West today. The Russians are determined not to be backward, not to be second best, but to be seen as the equals of their chief rival on the world arena today, the Americans. By today's standards, the greatness of a state is measured by its might as a nuclear power and its prowess in space. Hence, the Russians will make the sacrifices necessary to attain equality with America, or at least to project the image of equality, especially in those fields. By Western estimates, for example, Russia spent $45 billion on manned space flight from '58 to '73, compared to $25 billion spent by America. After the Americans landed on the moon, it was crucial to the Russians to have the Apollo-Soyuz flight to link up with the Americans in space in order to erase the image of being behind and to project the picture of parity. The second element of the answer lies in the split-level nature of Soviet society. In the West, military technology is closely related to the general level of technology in the entire economy. Not so in Russia. If something matters vitally to the state, it is specially done, and the chances are that it will be done quite well. If it is for the leadership or for premier scientists, ballet troupes, writers, athletes, people important to the state and its image in the West, no effort or luxury will be spared. though ordinary Russians have to tighten their belts to pay for it. An American doctor noting this split quality in Soviet society remarked to me, "The Russians can put a man in space, but they can't keep elevators operating. They can do the most sophisticated viral research, but they cannot treat common sickness so well. To me, it is not only a question of capability but of choice. Shoddy consumer goods for hoi-polley should not be taken as a gauge of the caliber of what is provided to the elite or to the defense ministry. Not only do defense and space efforts get top national priority in funding, but also they operate on a different system from the rest of the economy." Samuel Pizarro, an American lawyer, writer, and consultant on East-West trade, made the shrewd observation to me that the military sector is the only sector of the Soviet economy which operates like a market economy, in the sense that the customers pull out of the economic mechanism the kinds of weaponry that they want. Generally speaking, the Soviets have a push economy. Products are pushed out to consumers on orders from above, essentially repeating past production without tapping the inventions and new technology of Soviet scientists and laboratories and institutes. But the military, like customers in the West, has a pull effect. It can say, "No, no, no, that isn't what we want." Also, it can try out its tanks or its SAM-6 or SAM-7 missiles by selling them to the Arabs for a good profit and testing them in the field, and then come back with a market reaction for Soviet producers. Moreover, the Defense Ministry not only has its own system of closed factories engaged in military production, but throughout Soviet industry, the military operates on different standards than the normal civilian economy. Yuri, the metal worker, told me that his plant had 3 separate categories of products with different assembly lines and different work brigades, earning different levels of pay even though they were making the same items. One was for the armed forces, the second for export, and the third for common domestic use, for a nail, a tack, a teapot, for metal, uniforms, blankets, mittens, or for some apparatus. "This is the way it is done with everything," he said. Yosef, the refrigeration engineer from southern Russia, reported the same. "Common production pays less," he said. "Export and military production pay better, but requirements are higher. More time is spent on the work and quality specifications are higher. Such work is usually given to highly qualified workers." Rashid, the Tashkent tractor parts factory foreman, said that whenever military orders came to his factory for switches or lights or something like that, say for rockets, the armed forces sent detailed instructions for checking the quality of parts. I myself signed paper instructions for checking the quality of parts, saying that our production did not meet military specifications, and then we sold the same things to collective and state farms, various instruments, tools, wrenches, screwdrivers, spare parts, and so on. Another friend, a systems analyst who had worked on automated control systems in many factories, some of them closed, defense plants, as well as mixed civilian military plants, said there was no comparison in the quality control, even on ordinary items. The efficiency of the military and space programs rests in procurement checks. He advised, "Military officers sit in each factory. In the big factories, these are generals, and they operate with strict military discipline. They are empowered to reject junk, substandard items, and they reject great quantities of Brock, often at great expense, but the budget is padded to allow for that. Workers in the very same factories produce good refrigerators for the military and refrigerators that are largely junk for the civilian market, but nobody cares because there is no real quality control. I have seen how they made transistors. They would make 100 and the military representative would select only 1 or 2. Some would be thrown out as defective, and the rest would go to the civilian market. Even so, in the high-priority items of crucial importance to the state, in its military and space programs, and in key civilian projects as well, Soviet standards do not match those in the West. The Russians are reckoned to be up to 10 years behind America in the computer field. In early '75, a Soviet Academy of Sciences bulletin reported that the Soviet Union had only about 1/10 as many computers as America, most of them slower, second-generation, transistorized computers rather than the faster third-generation microcircuit computers in wide use in the United States. Nor is the difference merely one of outdated hardware. More than one Soviet computer expert privately told me that Soviet programming is far behind Western programming. An electronics engineer with years of experience in defense factories complained that unreliability of computers and other electronic gear was an even bigger headache. Our computers break down all the time, he said. There is no comparison in the downtime, time when computers are not operating, of our computers to yours. Yours are much more efficient. Nor have the special quality standards for Soviet export goods raised the caliber of Soviet technology enough to make it attractive to the West. Perhaps the easiest yardstick for gauging the relative difference of economies East and West is the lopsided flow of technology between them. According to the Soviet Monthly, Foreign Trade, the advanced West in 1974 bought only 170 million rubles worth of Soviet machinery and equipment. In other words, technology, whereas the Soviet Union bought 2 billion rubles from the West, a ratio of nearly 12:1 against Moscow. Were it not for oil, gas, gold, chromium, and rare metals, the exports essentially of an underdeveloped economy, Moscow could not afford trade with the developed West. Precision mechanics, precision technology, precision biochemistry are fields that Soviet scientists acknowledge that their system is weak on. It is easier to produce an atomic bomb or isotopes than to produce transistors or biochemical medicines, said a physicist. We have never had that kind of capability for precise technology. We are years behind. By concentration of effort and resources, the Russians have made important gains in space and military fields, forging ahead of all countries but America, in part because no others make the effort. But the best Western estimates still reckon that in development of sophisticated missilery and in manned space flight, the United States has a lead of several years, though the Russians pursued doggedly. The Apollo-Soyuz rendezvous mission in July '75 was an indicator of the American advantage. In the period leading up to the joint flight, one Soviet manned space mission was aborted at launch, and others failed in docking. During the joint flight itself, Russian cosmonauts had considerably more trouble docking with the American Apollo than vice versa. In fact, the mission plan deliberately assigned a more active role to the American spacecraft. As I watched it on television, I was reminded of a comment made to me by Vance Brand, one of the American crew members, at a July 4th reception at the American Embassy in Moscow in '74, a year before the flight. Brand and the other American astronauts had come to the Soviet Union to get acquainted with the Russian cosmonauts and their spaceship. When I asked Brand his general impressions, he sipped a glass of juice and tried to duck my question. Finally he said, "Well, after seeing the Soyuz up close, my admiration for the Russian cosmonauts has increased tremendously." Another American space official, interpreting this, said the American astronauts had been astonished at how primitive the Soviet Soyuz seemed in comparison with the American Apollo that had gone to the moon and back. "The cosmonauts just go along for the ride," the American said. "They are just passengers. They have nowhere near the control, the chance to change the mission in flight that our astronauts do." the Americans, who deliberately avoided making public comparisons, embarrassing to Moscow, were also surprised at how limited the life support and safety features of the Soviet spacecraft had been originally, and also at how the Russians went about fixing some malfunction. The Russians simply patched up the particular problem, the American officials said, whereas American technicians, using a systems approach, usually asked what other parts might be causing trouble, checked the whole system, and tried to do preventative maintenance. It was a measure not only of a gap in technical thinking, but also of a difference in the whole management outlook. Management ultimately has been the bête noire of the Soviet economy. Half a century ago, Lenin told his Bolshevik comrades to study American management techniques. Now Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin's son-in-law, the German Gizhvani, among others, is preaching a similar message. Curiously enough, influential elements within the Soviet military establishment are also behind the scenes among the more vigorous advocates of managerial reform in the Soviet system. Occasionally, a journal like Communist of the Armed Forces discreetly criticizes the rigidity of Soviet planning and urges more flexibility. Privately, too, I heard a very trustworthy report relayed in late '73 through a ranking West European communist leader with high-level contacts in Moscow that there was great uneasiness among the military high command as well as top industrial technocrats over deficiencies in Soviet economic management. By this account, these men wanted drastically to reduce interference by the Communist Party Central Committee apparatus in the operation of the economy. That, of course, had been one of the major objectives of the economic reform pushed in '65 by Prime Minister Kosygin. The theory then was that the Soviet economy could break out of technological stagnation and be revitalized by giving the heads of industrial enterprises much greater control over their own operations. The approach was to de-emphasize gross output as the chief indicator of economic success and to emphasize profitability instead, to promote efficiency as advocated by some economic reformers practically since Stalin's death in '53. But by the late '60s, the Kosygin reform had been sabotaged both by the party hierarchy and central ministries, jealous of their power and reluctant to relinquish any authority to industrial enterprises. Soviet friends contended too that Moscow's scare over political byproducts of the liberal economic drive in Czechoslovakia in '68 also helped kill economic decentralization in the Soviet Union. In April '73, another approach was pushed, this time by Brezhnev, formation of large industrial conglomerates called production associations, which were to be given broad new powers, including some greater authority for direct dealings in foreign trade. In support of this approach, Pravda ran an astonishingly forthright article by a leading liberal establishment economist, Abel Aganbegyan. He reported that in a poll of more than 1,000 industrial managers, 90% said they needed more flexibility in decision-making, and 80% blamed their problems on interference in normal operations by higher authorities. The most candid shot of all in this apparent campaign was a blistering, honest critique by Soviet standards of Soviet industry's inability to compete in the world market, written by Nikolai Smelyakov, a deputy minister of foreign trade who had once headed Amtorg, the Soviet trading company in America, and had traveled widely in the West. Smelyakov, writing in the December '73 issue of New World magazine, implicitly challenged some of the canons of Soviet economics: quotas, indices of plan fulfillment, marks of quality, and output norms. By influencing that in the tough arena of international trade, competitiveness was the only yardstick. Facing up to that, he declared, would be good medicine for Soviet industry. His critique made it plain he felt the hidebound Soviet bureaucracy was too rigid, constipated, and unimaginative, and that Soviet industry was too weak in promoting its products, adapting to the needs of the customer, and in follow-through with service and spare parts. While our planning and distribution organs wrote treaties on how many and what machines could be allocated for export, and whether it was possible to provide less and earn much more without providing the necessary spare parts, Smelikov wrote, while they argued about whether it would not humiliate our dignity to make good better for export than for domestic consumption, or was it not possible to sell abroad machines unsellable inside the country, or was it not possible to refrain from exporting machinery in great demand domestically? The highly developed capitalist countries already occupied the markets, straddled them, dug in, took commercial route, and developed exports of machinery and equipment on a colossal scale, and monopolized whole branches of industry to work on exports. With that kind of blunt critique, presumably backed by someone on high like Brezhnev, it looked as though winds of change were blowing for the Soviet economy. Word leaked that in November '73, Brezhnev was pushing for some shake-up in planning and management during the secret session of the Communist Party Central Committee for the sake of more efficiency. About the same time, some modern-minded mathematical economists were advocating relaxation of the ironclad input-output form of central planning set up by Stalin and still in effect, by which Moscow sought to decide on every last economic detail, generally for 5 years at a time. They wanted to substitute more flexible planning. They favored setting only general development targets and options, loosening controls, and openly revising the general plan every year. Within months, however, the conservative bureaucracy was beating back this idea, and President Nikolai Pozorny was telling the Soviet hierarchy not to worry about radical changes in the system. By early '75, it was clear that Brezhnev's program of production associations was being emasculated, even while it was technically being put into effect. A few big industrialists openly complained in the Soviet press that the ministries and the State Planning Council, which report to the Prime Minister Kazhin, had multiplied the amount of interference and had increased from 5 to 80 the plan indicators that industrial managers had to worry about. In short, decentralization was being blocked again by rivalries within the Politburo leadership and by conservative opposition of the top party and state bureaucracies. It's a stalemate, a high-level party journalist told me not long before I left Moscow. Our economy needs reform, but nothing will be reformed so long as Brezhnev, Pozorny, and Kashtin are still around. They can't agree on what to do, and none of them, even Brezhnev, is powerful enough to push through any big change against the will of the other two.